very briefly welcome. The Center for Nonprofit Leaders is jointly sponsored by the Business School of Fordham, Graduate Business School, the Graduate School of Social Work. We teach executive education. We have a master's degree in nonprofit leadership. Those of you who want to get involved, we have a lot of material outside. But our teaching is not just to create managers of nonprofit agencies, but get involved in social change, to change society. And that's what we talk about. We try to push our students. So it's fantastic to when Pat Cole became one of our students in the new master's degree program. We realized Pat, as a student, was ahead of many of the teachers here. And so she's terrific. It's a fantastic feeling to try to change society. We want to congratulate the Manhattan Chamber of Commerce for being one of those nonprofit agencies is not just accepting the status quo, but is trying to change society. So welcome. I thank Pat for moving us ahead to where we are now. You'll be hearing later from Associate Dean Elaine Congress, Associate Dean Francis Petit from the Business School, Elaine is from the School of Social Service. They'll wrap it up at the end, tell you what's upcoming events, and you're all more than welcome, and hopefully you will come. And the many ways you can get involved in the Center for Nonprofit Leaders. So let me turn it over to Nancy.
Morning, everyone. Morning. Thank you, Alan. Really appreciate Fordham hosting this event this morning. This is the second in our series of education for other nonprofits, for residents, but primarily for businesses in terms of what is anti-human trafficking, why they should know about it, what they can do about it, and try to move the needle forward to really change the landscape in the anti-human trafficking sector. So we've been working with Congresswoman Maloney and several other partners in trying to push the needle on this very important issue. So we want to thank you again for coming this morning, and we really have distinguished panelists this morning. Thank you for joining us. And I particularly want to thank Patricia Cole, who's our program director, as she is passionate about this. And as I say, this is a second in our series of educational forums, and we will continue to do so that we bring the awareness to the business community, whether they're individual sole proprietors or all the way up to the major corporations. And we know several corporations are already very engaged, and we will continue to work with them as well. So without further ado, I will turn the program back to Patricia, who will make some opening remarks and also moderate the forum this morning. So thank you all, and again, thank you Fordham for hosting us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. And I want to thank Dr. Lux, Dr. Congress, Dr. Keat, the folks at the center. I want to thank also our logistical wonder folks who have really helped us from the center and from the Manhattan Chamber of Commerce as well. I also need to recognize and would like to recognize the Religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary NGO, Network for Peace Through Dialogue, the NGO Committee to Stop the Trafficking in Persons, and Guidepost Solutions for their tremendous collaboration and support. So thank you for your presence today. As committed social justice partners and leaders, this is yet another step forward in recognizing and understanding the issue of human trafficking, its implications, its consequences, and more importantly, its resolution. On this anniversary of Abraham Lincoln, we are reminded that this is a marathon and not a sprint. We can and we will put an end to human trafficking and modern slavery. Today we continue our Manhattan Chamber series, What Business Can Do to Fight Human Trafficking. Human trafficking is not only a social justice issue, it's a human rights issue. It is a corporate social responsibility issue. Our program encourages good business to adopt and expand internal standards which effectively identify, prevent, and eliminate human trafficking. As we know, important strategies include adopting sound compliance, educating management and staff, notifying partners and suppliers, and supporting effective legislation. On that note, we are asking, and please do take time to endorse our two pieces of legislation. the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, which recently passed the House and is on the way to the Senate, and also the reintroduction of the business supply chain transparency. That said, as an honorary board member of the Manhattan Chamber of Commerce, I particularly appreciate the role and the influence that the Chamber and its membership serve as key drivers of social change in the community. We understand the power of community coalition and advocacy and action. By partnering together in a concerted way, we can boost our ability to make an impact. Consequently, our panel today highlights the value of cross-sector engagement, commitment, and partnership, and it will address human trafficking and corporate responsibility from the business, from the government, and from the nonprofit perspective. We have a full agenda. I will be moving ambitiously through the program. We will hold our Q&A after our panelists have made their comments, so please jot down your questions while you're waiting. We are aiming to wrap at 10 a.m. We will have the room until 10:30 for those that can join us to do a bit of networking as well. That said, we are going to begin our program with David Arkless. David Arkless is president of International CDI Corporation. He is founding counselor, board member of GBCAT, the Global Business Coalition Against Trafficking. He will now kick off the panel for us today. Thank you, David.
I love this. You've got 10 minutes to go through the whole of the potential of the corporate world to stop the heinous crime of human trafficking, modern-day slavery. I wish sometimes we could say that about you've got 10 minutes, Senate, UN, ILO, to stop human trafficking. 10 minutes, just do it. That's what they say to speakers, just get the job done. And I think that's what we need to do. My name's David. As you can tell from my accent, I'm Swiss. I am, seriously. So I can be neutral in this whole thing. But I do represent, or try to represent, a corporate and business approach on this huge issue. For my sins, and for great return and reward to myself, I've been working on this issue for 20 years. But I've always been in corporate while I've been doing that. Essentially, I've had a very simple career. University, Hewlett-Packard, private company that I founded, consulting company, Manpower Group for 25 years, and then retired. As you can tell, I look retired now, so I just decided to take over another $1.5 billion company and make it a global company, whilst trying to keep the company and the industry of human resources and talent focusing on how to stop the crimes that we're talking about. Just a little bit of background on what we do, or we try to do in the corporate world. And I know when I speak to what I call a mixed group, and a mixed group is a group that kind of embodies every kind of party that's working on this, some of whom are hostile to each other, or at least deeply suspicious. And the entity that is the most suspicious in this work is the corporate world. Why? You're only doing it for your image. You're only doing it for your brand. You're only doing it because the government introduced a supply chain act. Well, actually that's true for a lot of companies. A lot of companies will only do whatever does the right thing to improve return on shareholder value. That's it. That's why corporations were invented. You don't get promoted or grow or be successful in an industry unless you do a commercial thing really well. And so historically, everything's been focused on doing that. And then, of course, we have the environmental movement, human rights movement, saying not only do you have to do that, but you've also got to return something to humanity. And most people in most companies say that's a good thing. The problem is translating that into reality. So a whole bunch of years back, the company I was in, Manpower Group, the world's largest employer outside of governments, 18 million people a year. It's not Walmart, by the way, it's Manpower that's the biggest employer privately. So you place 18 million in 100 countries around the world, and they're your employees. And eventually they kind of get back to you. I hate employees. They're always telling you stuff that you need to do. And In Manpower Group, they came back to us maybe 19 years ago and said, we're a fantastic company. We've had a mission of putting people into jobs for 60, 70 years. It's one of the most noble things you can do. Give a person training, development, give them a decent job that's safe so that they can have more pride in themselves and they can provide for their families. It's a great thing. But our employees said, but we don't stand for anything globally. What do you mean we don't stand for stuff? And I'd recently kind of taken over the corporation. I said, we stand for decent work and we work with our friends at the ILO and whatever. And the employees said to us in a global survey, it's not good enough. What are our values and our core brand statements? And we went, hey, we've never done that. Hey, why don't we do a thing like Nike where we rebrand and get a cool new swish or something? So we did a huge program on rebranding the company. When you do that, you go out to partners, associates, customers, suppliers, and say, well, what do you think of what we stand for? And a lot of the stuff that came back was not much apart from making money out of people. And I didn't like that. So we started a program and we said to employees, what should we stand for? And the view was we should stand for giving everyone that wants in the world, anywhere in the world, the right to work, to decent work, which is actually what the strapline of the International Labour Office is. We said that's fine, but if we stand for that, we should stand against the opposite. And I defined three things as the opposite. The abuse of women and children in modern-day slavery. The use of sexually abusive acts. Secondly, trying to help every refugee in the world get some kind of a skill so that they can either start a small business if they're permanently displaced or find a job where they are permanently displaced. There are more refugees unemployed than any other grouping of people anywhere in the world. And the last one was try to stop the abuse of migrant workers. 250 million of them worldwide, many of them abused into forced labour and modern-day slavery. And we've worked hugely with the UN and the ILO and UNHCR on those programs. It's easy to say that's what we stand for, that we want to stop these things. How do you do it? So I put a program together and went to the board of Manpower Group. And, there are all these old Midwest guys, all grey, and, they sit there in, cowland and go, how much money is this going to cost, David? And I said, hey, first year, not much, about 20 million. That was literally the response. And they said, the word began with F. Are you insane? And I said, no, I'm not. This is going to be great. It's going to be great for our employees, for what we do, and we can lead the business community globally, the Fortune 500 at least. And they said, it's not going to work. Have you seen our margins recently? See what IBM's doing to our business margins this year? Anyway, so we go through that and I said, let me do an experiment. Let me take one country. I like that. He said, let me take a country. I'll take Sweden, see what we can do on refugees and immigrant workers and, influencing the government on strategy of, trying to stop sexual abuse through prostitution, cross-border prostitution, the whole thing. And that went quite well. And what we did was we measured what we call employee engagement as we involved every employee in these programs, working in refuges, training refugees, training women that had been saved off the streets, women that had been kind of abused and brought from Russia and Finland. And we just worked, every employee got involved over a 2-year period. And something called employee engagement, as you measure it in corporations, went up by 300%. What does that mean, employee engagement, 300%? It means this person believes in your brand, believes that they want to work for you, and stays longer. That's the important bit in this calculation. Stays longer and performs better because they believe in what you're doing. If you can reduce, in a company like Manpower, what you Americans call attrition every year, that means people get fired or leave. If you can reduce it by 1% globally, through reduced costs of replacements, training, customer relationships, productivity, you save the company $250 million US. And we did the whole ROI calculation. I went back to the board and said, interested in $500 million, I want 20 million. So we started these programs. We then helped start something in Europe and the Middle East called End Human Trafficking Now, which was one of the first organizations to gather corporations and companies to sign up to check procurement chains, supply chains, change HR policies to say it's unacceptable in our company if you're traveling on company business, that you hire a woman, a child, or a man in a hotel and you do whatever you do to them. Unacceptable if you're on company expenses. We even kind of advanced that later to say, we find it unacceptable if you even do that in your spare time. And if we find out, if a whistleblower says you do that in the company, we're going to put you into a counselling program because this is wrong. This is a breach of human rights. So we introduced that and then we tried to spread it to other companies. Right, that's gone pretty well. The corporate world has started to sign up. The important thing here, though, and I know I've got to finish my 10 minutes before we then fix human trafficking within the next 10 minutes. Getting up to date, there's been a heck of a lot of activity, some great initiatives, top down and bottom up, from government, international, not-for-profit and corporations. And that's the secret. It's about a unique and efficient coordination of all of the efforts and heart and soul and money and programs that all of those organizations are putting together. And from the business community through Global Business Coalition Against Trafficking, the kind of mid-level programs like demand-side abolition in the US, or the Seattle programs of business trying to end sex slavery, we can do these things. And I think the corporate world needs to bring its discipline and its rigor of implementing processes to help people and organizations that absolutely know what they're doing and know the guts of the problem and know how things can get fixed. What we have is money and process and systems, and we can put our own act in order, but we can help medium-sized organizations, international organizations, policing organizations sometimes to get the job done. And this is top-down, bottom-up, side-to-side, which is why the Manhattan Chamber has been hugely important in developing something that we can start locally. Forgive me for calling Manhattan a locality, but it's a locality in the definition of the world. So we're doing lots of things. Can business make a big difference? One last example. I decided to change a whole country. But it wasn't Sweden this time. I decided I wanted government, international organizations, the law, corporations, all on one side to do something very special. I decided to choose the UK. Everyone thinks that Great Britain started the fight against against slavery, and it did. Wilberforce started that process through implementing the word of the law very cleverly and very carefully back then. And my line to Cameron when I went to him was, we started this job here, we never finished it. This country is a disgrace. And he said, well, nobody knows what refugee situations, asylum seekers, child abuse, sex slavery, forced labor of Vietnamese in marijuana factories. Nobody knows the numbers on this. And I said, I'm going to bring you back the numbers, and you're going to do something about it. So in the business community in the UK, we commissioned the most forensic report on modern-day slavery that anyone has seen worldwide. And we're now trying to replicate that everywhere. Because, as one of my friends in private equity just down the road here in Manhattan says, David, without the data, you're just another idiot with an opinion. Okay? So we got the data in the UK. It was this thick. It was amazing. It showed the real problem. And it was huge. It was endemic. So we went back to the Cabinet Office and saw Cameron and said, there you go, my friend. We dare you not to do something about this. Oh, and by the way, we've had some law lord friends of ours write a draft Modern-Day Slavery Act for you. So it's not even going to cost anything for you to put this into Parliament and a vote and then the Queen's speech and then legislation. It took us 2 years. We got a bunch of MPs and lords on side. We pushed that through. The Houses of Parliament, the Modern-Day Slavery Act was announced in the last Queen's speech in the UK. That will fundamentally change the ability of policing forces, ministries, not-for-profits, corporations, and people in the street to solve the problem of modern-day slavery. So, it's all about data, into recommendations, into policy, into law, and then into practice. And the toughest bit is policy into practice. And that's what we're trying to work on from the corporate community. I've got about another 6 hours of stuff to tell you about, but I'd better stop there, given that I've now taken 11 3/4 minutes. Thank you very much indeed.
David, thank you so much. tremendous insight into our advancements on the corporate side, thanks to you and your remarkable leadership, as always, as we know. And hopefully more to come on that. And now we're going to turn to Rosalie Keach. Rosalie is the board member and UN observer for the League of Women Voters of the United States. Rosalie?
Good morning. And building on what you heard from David, trafficking is a problem that can be solved if the private sector is involved. I have a little presentation. Modern slavery, human trafficking, or trafficking in persons has been defined as the act of recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining a person for compelled labor or commercial sex acts through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Many times an individual gets duped when seeking a better life from violence or poverty. The U.S. produces an annual Trafficking in Persons report, or the TIP report. The TIP report from 2014 indicated a common perception of trafficking victim is of a woman kidnapped, made to cross a border, forced into sexual slavery, and physically beaten. The reality of trafficking is frequently much more subtle. Vulnerable individuals may be aware of and initially agree to poor working conditions or the basic duties of the job that underlies their exploitation. Victims may sign contracts and thereby initially agree to work for a certain employer, but later find they were deceived and cannot leave the job because of threats against their families or overwhelming debts to the recruitment agency, end quote. Let me tell you about two stories of two women I've met. The first, a woman, college educated, from Asia, and a government employee, lost her job. She said she was recruited for a new opportunity in the U.S. and was met at Kennedy Airport by what she thought was the recruiting agent. Her passport was confiscated, she was beaten, and forced into sexual trafficking. And if you think it only happens with foreign nationals, think again. The second woman from New Jersey went to Boston for her freshman year of college. She met a man, went out on a date with him. The second date turned out to be at his apartment, where she was drugged and forced into trafficking. She related that it took her 8 years of living hell, being beaten, starved, threats to kill her family, and rapes before she was allowed to escape. But what does this have to do with legitimate corporate business? A lot. The other major component of human trafficking or slavery is that of compelled labor. Forced to work at a job under the same kinds of threats and quite often physical or sexual violence. Day laborers, cleaning staff, miners, garment, factory workers, and even construction workers at the FIFA World Cup site for 2022 have reported abuse. If the worker is deceived, has his or her passport confiscated, subject to physical or sexual violence or threats, is not allowed to leave, or is not allowed to keep the salary because of exorbitant fees to cover travel, housing, or food, that person is coerced and a victim of trafficking. As you can see from the next diagram, in the Americas, victims are equally dispersed between sexual and labor trafficking. And just like the worker, legitimate corporate businesses can be duped. Take this story found in The Observer, written by Dan McDougall on Sunday, October 28, 2007. Headline, quote, Indian slave children found making low-cost clothes destined for Gap. Story, 54 child workers, some as young as 10, have been found working in a textile factory in conditions close to slavery to produce clothes that appear destined for Gap kids, one of the most successful arms of the high street giant. Speaking to The Observer, the children described long hours of unwaged work, as well as threats and beatings. Can you imagine the reaction of the CEO, the auditors, the compliance officers, What about the insurers, the investors, the consumers? I can tell you firsthand the reaction when one learns about modern slavery. It is a call to action. And using UN language, it has become a multi-sectoral call to action. People from all walks of life, as evidenced in this room, are banding together to do something about ending slavery. The League of Women Voters of the United States at its last convention in 2014 agreed and voted to actively engage in fighting human trafficking. That means we can reach hundreds of thousands of followers and members to advocate for better laws as well as enforcement of those laws. And it's not just a bunch of little old ladies. Governments are involved. Here in the U.S., in addition to President Obama's executive order, the White House Partnerships is working with non-governmental organizations, faith-based organizations, and reaching out and fighting this $150 billion industry. The National Association of Attorney General's Human Trafficking Task Force produces a monthly newsletter of arrests and highlights throughout the U.S. And as a member of New Jersey's Attorney General's Human Trafficking Task Force and chair of its Outreach and Awareness Committee, I make sure that that newsletter is shared with coalition partners, including STIP and others in the UN community. And we share best practices. We know that Brazil used a similar program as New Jersey in fighting trafficking at major events as the 2014 World Cup, because the special representative to the UN Secretary General worked with Brazil's ministers in implementing a comprehensive multi-sectoral strategy that we had jointly developed. And Her Excellency Lourdes Maria Bandeira was kind enough to share their World Cup plans as a speaker at an event we organized 2 years ago. With regards to the UN, many internal agencies are involved in the fight against human trafficking. The UN's Office of Drugs and Crime, UNODC, marked the first World Day Against Trafficking in Persons, I Give Hope, on July 30, 2014. USA Network and the stars of Graceland, Suits, Covert Affairs, and Royal Pains, as well as celebrities like actress Jada Pinkett Smith, pianist Chloe Flower and Lang Lang, as well as singer Nicole Scherzinger, joined forces in spreading the word. A thunderclap, this is a new term for me, a coordinated message launched collectively across Twitter, Facebook, and Tumblr on July 30th reached more than 5.5 million people. This movement is spreading. Quoting from the U.S. 2014 TIP report again, innovation and technology are essential in the fight against human trafficking. The private sector, anti-trafficking advocates, law enforcement officials, academics, and governments are working together to develop innovative solutions to address the complexities involved in both fighting this crime and supporting victims as they strive to restore their lives. And while we're seeing better organization within and amongst governments, law enforcement, and anti-trafficking advocates, quite frankly, what seems to be lagging behind is the private sector, including legitimate corporate citizens. After all, modern slavery is business. It's big business. Its market cap at $150 billion is bigger than Citigroup's. And the pure economics of it is that if there were no demand, there would be no supply. This September 2014 edition of the UN's Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Persons, also known as ICAT, everything is acronyms at the UN. That paper series, issue 2, titled Preventing Trafficking in Persons by Addressing Demand, talks about, amongst other things, recruiting agents and other intermediaries that may trap workers through the imposition of large and illegal debt, compounded by inflated interest rates that allow them to appropriate the earnings of these workers over an extended period of time. And here's the main point. Many times, the hiring corporation isn't even aware that it's occurring. The hiring corporation is duped, just like the labor victim. So what can you do to protect yourselves? Examine your current risk. Do you have exposure in countries that are more prone to labor violations? Do you have business operations that finance, insure, or utilize classifications of workers that are more prone to exploitation? What about joint ventures or outsourced operations? Do you have a zero-tolerance policy for your employers, subcontractors, or agents? I'm not advocating for any product or company, but just want to draw your attention to the fact that there are technology innovations that are starting to appear. According to an article in Wired by Issy Lepowski on February 3rd, the next big thing you missed, software that helps businesses rid their supply chains of slave labor, it mentions a product called FRDM, Freedom, where businesses can upload data on all of the items they buy and where their suppliers are located. And FRDM will generate a dashboard explaining who the riskiest suppliers are. The TIP report also mentions technology innovations. And Google and Microsoft both sponsor contests on promising innovations. And many some consulting companies will also look for signs of human trafficking when engaged in due diligence efforts. The other way you can protect yourself is by leveraging your existing social responsibility programs, including Code of Conduct, harassment, and FCPA. Businesses are the next frontier in fighting human trafficking. Investors, consumers, as well as regulators are banding together. Join us. With the skills that you bring to the table, as David mentioned, we can win this fight. It's not only smart business, it's the right thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosalie. Thank you for those insights, and particularly into best practices on the business operations side, compliance side as well. And now we're going to turn to Deborah Brown Steinberg, who is the founder of VS, which is Confronting Modern Slavery in America. She's a retired partner of Cadwallader, Wickersham, and Taft. She was recently featured on Nick Kristof's documentary, A Path Appears. We're delighted to have our friend Deborah Steinberg.
My topic today is evolving anti-trafficking legislation, and any discussion on that topic has to begin with the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. The TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, established the 3P framework: prevention, protection, and punishment, as a guide to legislation in the United States to prevent and combat human trafficking. In 2003, the first anti-trafficking legislation at the state level was passed, with Washington and Texas leading the way. In 2014, last year, Polaris Project, which is a national resource and advocacy anti-trafficking program, tracked the state's progress in enacting anti-trafficking legislation. And for the first time, they found that all states, all 50 states, now have enacted the basic legal response to anti-trafficking that Polaris recommended. Before you applaud, Polaris is quick to say, and I would agree, that this success does not mean that the job is done. In fact, it's far from done. While all 50 states have now passed criminal anti-trafficking legislation, most states lack adequate enforcement and implementation and adequate funding. The laws on the books, whether they're law enforcement or they're victim services, are not effectively implemented, and they do not serve victims wisely. And the laws that have been passed focus almost entirely on sex trafficking, and with particular emphasis on child sex trafficking, to the virtual exclusion of labor trafficking. In January of this year, 2015, the House passed 8 bipartisan bills aimed primarily at sex trafficking, again with particular emphasis on child victims. Those bills, in broad sense, treat children in the sex trade as victims, not criminals. They incentivize states to adopt full safe harbor laws that protect children from anti-trafficking prosecutions and that offer them specialized services. They criminalize advertising services for sex with minors, and they authorize much-needed grants for child trafficking deterrence programs, shelters for survivors, and strengthening the state welfare systems to better identify and document child victims. But none of those bills focused on labor trafficking. People intuitively respond to the sexual exploitation of children. But the problem is so much greater than that. Labor trafficking is a serious problem, not just globally, but in America. And luckily and happily, the media is beginning to pay attention. Yesterday's New York Times carried a story about the labor abuses of workers at construction projects in Abu Dhabi. The projects under construction are a new campus for NYU and branches of the Guggenheim and Louvre museums in Abu Dhabi. The article editorialized, and I think any business who hears this said about them should shiver, planting the flag of a Western university's liberal ideals in an economy that rests on the labors of impoverished migrant workers was an undertaking with moral perils. Also this week, Newsweek's front page article is on prostitution rings in farm labor camps in America, in New York, in upstate New York. I commend it to you. It's shocking. On January 29 of this year, Secretary of State John Kerry spoke at a White House forum on combating human trafficking and supply chains. He said, "When we purchase produce at a grocery store, we rarely think about the farm workers right here in the U.S. who are paid substandard wages and live in horrific conditions in the U.S. with physical and verbal abuse, sexual harassment, and discrimination. The magnitude and the enormity of this challenge cannot be overstated." Secretary Kerry presented the Presidential Award for Extraordinary Efforts to Combat Human Trafficking to the Coalition of Immokalee, I hope I said that right, workers. Immokalee, forgive me. That's kind. The coalition has uncovered farm slavery operations across the southeastern United States. It has eradicated human trafficking in farms participating in its Fair Food program. It has leveraged market resources and consumer awareness to promote supply chain transparency at participating farms. And more exciting than anything, it has solicited major support of buyers of produce from, among others, McDonald's, Burger King, Subway, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, and others. Secretary Kerry identified supply chains as, quote, one of the greatest zones of impunity where traffickers can prey on their victims. The sources of the problem, he said, include people desperate for work, unscrupulous labor workers who lie to recruit their workers, companies that turn a blind eye to abuses, and customers who are looking for savings without regard to the implications of those savings. President Obama, a couple of years ago, issued an executive order to root out human trafficking in the federal supply chains. On the legislative front, in 2012, California began implementing its Transparency in Supply Chains Act. That act incentivizes supply chain compliance by promoting consumer and investment decision-making. In 2014, Congress modeled the Business Supply Chain Transparency on Trafficking and Slavery Act on the California statute. The federal bill, had it been passed, would have required companies with minimum $100 million in annual gross receipts to report to the SEC and on the company's websites about their supply chain and labor management practices. It would not require, and this is important, it would not require companies to take any specific action. This is a pure transparency measure. I'm informed by Carolyn Maloney's office, who sponsored the bill in the last session, that bill will be reintroduced in this Congress, and I urge you all to support it. Currently, there is no effective oversight of the recruitment process to protect guest workers in the United States from abuse. Labor recruiters lure poor, desperate foreign workers to the U.S. with promises of good jobs and green cards. They use coercive tactics, chief among them exorbitant illegal fees that trap those workers in debt bondage and other forms of slavery. Right now, in federal court in Louisiana, there is a major groundbreaking civil case going to trial. It was filed by Indian guest workers who were brought to the United States to repair oil plants and ships that were damaged by Katrina. The plaintiffs in that case alleged that their employer tricked them with false promises of green cards, and after they arrived, they were subjected to brutal living conditions in company-run camps in this country. The Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Modernization Act, which was also introduced last session, if passed, would have injected transparency and into the guest worker program by requiring registration and disclosure by foreign labor contractors to prevent the exorbitant fees. And it would have provided business and workers with tools to identify and use legitimate foreign labor brokers. Companies are beginning to understand that there is a business case for developing human trafficking risk management and compliance policies. Public transparency, combined with public rankings of companies' performance, is a powerful tool in driving the competitive race to the top. Secretary Kerry, in his remarks at the White House conference, reinforced this message. Laws, regulations, and executive orders, he said, are necessary, but they are not sufficient. They won't do it alone. Everybody has a responsibility here. And President Obama separately completed that thought. Every citizen, he said, can take action by speaking up and insisting that the clothes they wear, the food they eat, and the products they buy are made free of forced labor. That is the call to action that I leave you with today. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Great insights, as always, to the evolving, changing legislation and landscape. And again, we're going to ask you in conjunction with the call to action that you heard about today. Again, there are two pieces of legislation. Deborah has spoken about both of them. One is the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, just passed the House. It's on the way to the Senate. And the second is the Business Supply Chain Transparency. It will be reintroduced. We need your support. We're asking you to please sign the petitions in the back before you leave today to ensure that you, again, participate and join in. Next we have, and we're delighted to have John Temple. John Temple is the attorney in charge, Human Trafficking Program at the New York County District Attorney's Office. Great to see you, John. Thank you.
Good morning. It's always hard to go last because that means everyone's kind of off their coffee buzz from earlier in the morning, so I'll try to stay within my 10 minutes. But like David, I have a number of things I want to talk about, and I think all of us up here today could have spoken basically all day, but then everyone would have wanted to leave. So we're going to try to keep you wanting to be here. And I'm going to give you a little just brief background about what the Human Trafficking Response Unit does, which is the unit within the Manhattan DA's office that I run. When we first started looking at trafficking, the New York State anti-trafficking law was passed in 2007. And when we as an office started looking at what we could do to implement that law and enforce its provisions, we said, all right, let's take a look. We handle roughly 100,000 plus cases, criminal cases a year in Manhattan. So let's just see how many people are walking in and saying that I'm a victim of human trafficking. Any guesses? 0. We had not a single person walking in saying, hello, I'm a victim of human trafficking. And yet we were educating ourselves. We were working with NGO partners. We were doing our research. We were conducting our due diligence. And by all accounts, no matter how you feel about what the ultimate numbers are, there's a lot. And certainly 0 was far too few that we should be finding. So we had to look at what we were doing internally and say, all right, how can we adjust? How can we pivot and do a better job at figuring out what's going on here? And we were educated on many of the reasons why victims of trafficking don't come forward. Possibly traumatic bonding with a trafficker, also known as Stockholm Syndrome. Looking at issues of fear of law enforcement, possibly had been arrested previously, negative interactions with law enforcement, threats of deportation, lack of language skills, inability to even know help exists or what the laws are. And so we said we need to become the most friendly place in the city to report a human trafficking crime. And so we did that in a number of ways. The first is we, in Manhattan, opened what's called the Family Justice Center on the 5th floor of 80 Center Street. The Family Justice Center, it's part of a movement, but it's focused mostly on domestic violence, family violence issues. And it's a unique public-private partnership where you have on one side of the floor, you have ADAs from the Special Victims Bureau, and on the other side of the floor, you have service providers who are providing immigration conferencing, domestic violence counseling, social workers. So the idea became then, if you have somebody who, say, came in looking for domestic violence help, and it turns out they have a trafficking issue, they have a child abuse issue, they have a whole host of special victims issues, instead of saying, look, why don't you go to the precinct and speak to an officer who's in a uniform, has a gun, has handcuffs on, we can walk you right across the hallway and you can go down and talk to John. And talking to John sounds a lot better than cooperating with law enforcement. And so we wanted to try to break down that area. So of family justice centers, which there are many, and the last one is about to open in Staten Island, we are unique in that our human trafficking unit is part of that, because we saw the correlation between family violence, violence against women and children, and we saw that correlation coming in. The second thing we did was to hire a full-time social worker and then integrate that person into every aspect of the process. When you are a victim of labor trafficking and you live at your employer's, if you don't have a place to then reside that night, you are not going to care about a criminal prosecution. And so we had to make sure that we were fulfilling the needs of our victims first before we thought about any prosecution, and we began to think about it in a secondary way. And so that our social worker now becomes primarily responsible for where are they sleeping, what are they eating, who are we going to connect them to. She's also responsible for connecting us to NGO partners who are the real ones who provide that service. So that was our sort of our first prong of our approach. But we knew that would only get us so far. And so the second prong of our approach was to develop what we term evidence-based prosecutions. Prosecutions that rely less and less upon victim cooperation and victim testimony. Because we know, despite our best efforts, that victims of trafficking are always going to be for a lot of very good reasons, reluctant to cooperate. And so we looked at other ways to build cases, to utilize technology. One of our hires in the unit was actually a computer scientist out of NYU. You might ask yourself, why would anyone need a computer scientist from NYU to work in a prosecutor's office? Well, it turns out that there's a lot of footprints that trafficking leads all over the place, and online is one of those areas. Our office recently partnered with DARPA, which is the Department of Defense's agency that they're actually the ones who invented the internet, despite other people you may have heard about. They invented GPS. They invented a whole host of things. And they turned their scientists, they turned these brilliant minds towards trying to detect sex trafficking online, and we're piloting a number of their tools that they're using. So we're bringing that connection. We're bringing technology to bear upon a very practical problem. We also looked to build other types of cases. Al Capone was ultimately indicted and tried on tax evasion charges. This is as somebody else mentioned before, this is a business crime. It may involve a whole host of other crimes, but if all you can get is a money laundering charge, then you should bring that charge. If you can disgorge the ill-gotten gains, the assets that traffickers have received off the backs of the people that they're victimizing, we should do that and make sure that the victims are being appropriately compensated for that. And so that became our goal in forming the unit. And so within the unit, the DA Cy Vance, has placed a lot of emphasis on this. And our unit's about 30 people strong at the moment, which I think really shows his commitment to this as a topic. Now, despite, though, all of these resources that we've been putting into this, we've made very good strides in a number of places, but one of the most vexing problems that continues to persist today is identifying labor trafficking rings. And identifying, it's easier in many ways, to investigate a sex trafficking ring. Prostitution is illegal in New York. We have the facilities to already investigate those. When you turn those same skills towards trafficking, it's a little easier to do. But you can't just investigate an entire industry hoping that you find labor trafficking. You need more. And this is why I'm really so pleased to be in front of this group, and in particular with this distinguished panel, because I really do believe that it are these public-private partnerships that really could make the difference in terms of how to identify so that good corporate entities are not utilizing labor traffic. But one step beyond that is, what do you do with that information once you have that? You've identified a bad actor. You've identified somebody who you believe may be engaging in unfair labor practices that may ultimately lead to labor trafficking. So, yes, good corporate citizen, you are not using that group, but what do you do with that information? Well, if I could provide that answer, I would say call me, because that's what we're looking for. That's what we're looking to find. And it's sort of a hackneyed phrase, especially in New York, the see something, say something motto, but it really makes sense in this area, because if you see something that is happening, it's incumbent upon us as either good corporate citizens, individuals of conscience, to make sure that something's done about it. And we are the ones who can actually go in and try to do something about it. And you can rest assured that our victim-centered approach will be our guiding principles in what we're doing. So to give an example, this has already happened with our office and many others, but I give our office as an example because I was involved in it. A year or two ago, the DA convened a banking roundtable with all of the heads of the anti-money laundering programs of about 10 or 12 major international banks, along in partnership with the Thomson Reuters Foundation. So we held a series of banking roundtable meetings that included myself and members from my office, these heads of the AML programs, nonprofits, and sat around for a number of days and said, we talked about the digital footprint, what is the financial footprint of trafficking operations on the legitimate financial sector? You have funds that are being laundered. How can we develop a footprint? How can we get that information out to other AML programs? And how can they then identify those bad actors within their systems and then be able to work with law enforcement collaboratively to root out these kind of groups from using legitimate financial institutions? And the product of that work was a white paper that included the red flags of trafficking. A document then that we were able to send out to a number of institutions that was then used to generate investigative leads that could then be hunted down through law enforcement channels that are prescribed by law. So I think that's an example, and it's a relatively small scale example though, of how public-private partnerships can work. And I think it's so crucial in this particular area. One other thing I just wanted to sort of touch on, because one of the things I think we often have problems with when we go to these kind of things is you walk away saying, great, I'm fired up, I want to do something, let's get out there, let's save the world, let's save people, and that's awesome. I mean, I think that's incredible, and that's the way you should feel about this. Anyone would feel that when they hear such terrible things happening. So let me give you a few actual practical things that you could do. And the interesting part about this is that since this is all relatively new, quote unquote, in terms of how law enforcement, how other groups are beginning to deal with this, we don't know how much will work. We have no idea. We have a lot of good guesses, but if something doesn't work, we need to try it and then move on to the next one. We have to be scientific about this in our approach. So my suggestions, and take them for what you will, is for businesses who are here, you all probably, or many of you, subcontract your cleaning services. To subcontract to cleaning services, to make sure that there are provisions within the contract that say that there will not be any exploitive labor practices, and be specific about it. The ILO has a number of these kind of provisions out that I'm sure they'll be happy to give you to incorporate. But go beyond that. Don't just say, oh, well, we have a corporate provision. Ask a question. There's somebody who walks into your office to take out the garbage. Talk to them as a human. See what they could see, what their living conditions are like. See what is happening. Engage with that person. It's very simple, but it makes all the difference in the world. You're not investigators. You're not going out, but you're just showing your basic humanity in terms of engaging with somebody. It takes a few minutes out of your day. But it helps to show what may or may not be out there. There was a recent, relatively recent federal case where there was a group of Russian men, I believe, who were being trafficked into the U.S. And then they were a subcontractor who provided cleaning services to some major hotel chains. And so they were literally the people in your hotel room who are coming in and cleaning. And you would think a large multinational that wants to do the right thing would know that if there was trafficked labor who were literally cleaning their rooms, and they didn't. And I think you talk about supply chain transparency, and you talk about the difficulties of supply chain transparency. And when you have a sub, how can I be held responsible for what happens 20 chains down the link? Yes, that is very difficult, and I see that a good corporate actor can have problems all the way down the line. But that doesn't mean that the end user of whatever the service is, whatever the product is, doesn't have the right to demand the answer from below, and demand that the one from below makes that answer, and demand one that makes the answer below, and so on and so forth. We were talking a little bit earlier, and you think about this as an attractable problem. And sister, you said that there are no, I'm going to butcher your line here, but she said that there are no sort of insolvable answers. These are problems that were created by humans, and they can be fixed by humans. And my call to action today would be, let's fix them then. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for the overview of the District Attorney's program, their network, the inspiring examples of making a difference in survivors' lives, and for clarifying how to work in partnership to recognize, report, and help save lives. Thank you very much. So let's give the panel an incredible round of applause. Yeah. Clearly, with this brilliance, this talent, this expertise, we know we can win this battle. We are very fortunate to have everybody here on this panel and sharing all of their work and their inspiration with us today. So thank you again very much. Now we're going to turn to some questions and answers for our panel.
Thank you. Name is Frederick. The question is first for Deborah and then maybe David. I want to know, is there a strategic reason why transparency only and no action as it relates to this legislation or proposed legislation?
I would say it's because of two things. One is that's what Congress thinks they can get passed. And two, one size doesn't fit all. I think it would be hard to legislate a specific program that would fit every business. I think it would be very difficult to craft legislation that would fit all industries, all businesses, large and small, global businesses, local businesses. So I think that complexity combined with the reality of getting a law passed has left this as a transparency measure, and studies are beginning to show that transparency works because informed consumers and informed investors want to know and invest their money and their product buying in companies that share their values. So it's beginning to work, and I think that it's up to all of us when we make decisions about what to buy, whether it be a product or a share of stock, that we look at whether they have the companies disclose labor management practices and whether we think they are doing a good job.
I'd just like to make a very brief comment on that. The inability of your legislators in this country to actually do the right thing with things like the California Act and push it right through into detail and make sure that companies are really accountable, and if they're not, they kick them up the arse and cost them billions, is a failure of your political system in this country. It's a cop-out. There's a bunch of, I was just in Washington last week, there's a bunch of lobbyists from various industries that know this would cost them hundreds of millions to implement. And your politicians are absolutely avoiding the issue by not implementing the legislation that should be implemented. You've got to make them do it. Look, I don't mean to get on my hobby horse. This is exactly what we went through in the United Kingdom. The only way we could get this done in the end was actually by analysing the voting patterns and the motivations behind the opinions of every single member of Parliament and who was paying for their election campaigns and why. And you need to do that in the United States.
Thank you, David. I just also personally want to add, we're working with Free the Slaves, and we're working with Senator Blumenthal's office and Congresswoman Maloney's office as well on the reintroduction of the business supply chain. Deborah had mentioned it before. So we're heartened by the fact that hopefully with a little bit of drafting, it's going to be reintroduced. The volition is there. It's been already to the House twice. We're going to try and get it back to the House. That's why the signatures are important in these petitions today. They do have meaning. They do have impact. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Beth Adamson with the Working Group on Girls, and at least two people think I'm going to ask a question that's a follow-up on the girls, but I think you covered that really well. And I'm going to ask a different kind of question that I would love to hear the answer from each panel member, because you each bring such a really tremendously strong perspective from different angles. And that is, from where you sit, what is the worst misconception of the public, of the NGO world, of private industry, of any group, of any single group, that you would say works against what you are trying to do? That's it. And anybody who wants to speak, actually all five of you, I'd love to hear that answer from.
Thank you.
My biggest one is the misconception of cause and effect of the whole problem, issue, and concern. I think we're fixing symptoms and not causes all the way through this movement. If you really want to get down to it, we've got to start educating very, very young people, kids in school and beyond, consistently throughout their whole lives, that actually to abuse other human beings in any way, slavery, forced labor, forcing into prostitution, abusing women, children, actually is a fundamentally wrong thing to do and is not acceptable human behavior. I think we've got to go way back to the root cause of this. Why do young men think it's fine to pay money to abuse someone? There's something fundamentally and behaviorally wrong with that. So I think we've got to make sure that we do something about the cause.
I agree. It's on the demand side. Again, as I said before, if there were no demand, there'd be no supply. And the fact that you can use a human being over and over and over again, whether it's labor or sex, and make money off of that is just, it is criminal and it's heinous. I think the education is very important, but I also think that people of conscience and people and corporations that want to do the right thing, they really need to stand up and they really need to say, hey, I'm not going to tolerate this anymore. I'm having zero tolerance. I want to know who my suppliers are, who my subcontractors are, what are they bringing into the table. I want to audit it. I want to make sure that it's working well, and that when I have people going on a business trip, like we did with the presidential detail from the Secret Service, that they're not engaging in promoting the problem. Start arresting the Johns, unfortunately, and 70% of them say they wouldn't, and name and shame them like some countries do, Brazil, etc., that 70% of them wouldn't engage in it again if their wives and corporations know. The other thing I just want to mention on that topic is that Brazil has a law on the books called name and shame. And what it does, it doesn't only name the individual that is purchasing the illegal acts. It is also naming their corporation and placing them on a list. Now, they also have a white list, those corporations that are things that are doing business ethically. But they also have the other list. So,
for me, it's the gross misconception that it's not happening here, and that if it is happening here, it's sex and not labor. And that has caused an incredible misalignment of resources, both private and public resources. It is a misconception that it's only happening to the poor. It's happening to everyone. Now that we have internet is coming into the bedrooms of every class of people in this country, and every child is susceptible to being taken and abused. So I think that what I would say is that we have to re-examine in this country every conception and bias that we have on this, because it's leading us in false directions.
I'll make mine a little more personal. Is that if we could get people over their fear of law enforcement, we'd be able to help a lot more people. And so one of the things that I think, and I understand that that not everyone's the same, and many people have different approaches. So it's a combination of I think, having my colleagues in other areas take the same approach in terms of how we approach victims of trafficking, and to develop that trust with the NGO community, which I think we've been working on for a long time, and I think has led to dividends. But breaking down that trust barrier, where someone can come in, and if you're looking at it in the sex trafficking context, for example, somebody who has been so horrifically abused and raped for years, having to come in and speak to someone who looks like me in a suit, where I look like either someone who's arrested that person before or someone who's bought services from that person before, that's a very big trust gap in and of itself. So we're able to leverage goodwill of people who are doing this work and who are having access to victims and help us bridge that gap. And coincidentally, I don't wear suits when I do interviews just for that purpose. But it's I think that eliminating that fear in any way we can is a huge barrier for us and what we're able to accomplish.
By the way, John, it could be worse. They could come in and talk to someone like me. I just want to say something, two things to my two colleagues here. What Rosalie said earlier about it's not just groups of little old women. I've got a very good friend in Washington that says, I love to engage and really impassion groups of little old women. They're the 3 Fs. And I said, what are the 3 Fs? He said, feral, fearless, and fantastic. So let's get every group of old ladies we can on this issue. Second one is a very serious issue to Deborah's point about the facts, the data. It's not happening here. It's not happening in Manhattan. I had the great privilege of meeting your president. Forget the politics, whether you're with him or against him. He seems a very decent man to me, and he's really engaged on this issue, as is the vice president, or seems to be. And he said, David, global problem, criminal sector, almost, could be 150, 200 billion. And I went, blah, blah, blah. And his counselors went, nobody kind of does that to the president. I said, I've just been to, what's it called, the county that Seattle is in. King County, is it?
Kings County.
So they just did some research there through businesses and through people on the streets. And they found out that this is just men. 27,000 men solicit sex every day in King County. 20,000 are successful, $150 each, billion-dollar business in Seattle alone. Work out how many trillions that is in the United States, because you've got, I found out, 3,006 counties in the United States. Everybody is underestimating the problem, where it is. It's in your schools, it's outside your back door, it's in your communities. And we somehow have got to use the data. And by the way, that's something I'd really, really focus on in this country. Data, information. You changed your national sport through data. What was that movie called? Moneyball. You changed that funny game with a stick and a ball that you have. Unlike the real game, which is called cricket, by the way. You changed the whole game, the passion for the game, the way it was enacted, the professionalism, by looking at data very, very closely. I don't believe the old saying, it was Disraeli originally, made famous by Mark Twain here, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. Actually, statistics don't lie. It's the way they're interpreted and presented. So I think we've got a huge opportunity through all of our groups to really get the forensically analyzed data to every person in the streets. Because when I talk to people, most of them are horrified when you say, here's some basic stats about King County. And they go, nah, impossible. There's the data. Same as Cameron when I went, that's what's happening in the UK. So let's get the data, let's get it to the right people, let's get it communicated, let's get our politicians to do the right thing and not be influenced by their next set of votes and their lobby and who's paying for their re-election campaign. If we can do that, we can make a difference. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to kind of hijack another 3 minutes. Forgive me.
No, that's wonderful, David. Thank you. Yes, I think we have time for, a couple more questions.
Hi, good morning. I'm following up, David, on what you said. My name's Eileen Anasini. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the National Council of Jewish Women. And one of our key initiatives is anti-sex trafficking of women and children. And so I just wanted to mention that, commend this panel, and also show you, I've put out some of these flyers about our initiative, which is Exodus. So the first step in making any meaningful change is education. And you'll find quite a bit about sex trafficking and the work that we're doing in coalition and as a force with 90,000 supporters, advocates, and members across the United States. So I encourage you to get involved and get educated. And if you have any questions for me specifically, I'd be delighted. Our board member and chair of our anti-sex trafficking initiative, Beatrice Khan, is with me as well.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Wonderful. Yes.
Can I just say one other thing about that? New Jersey is part of our Super Bowl efforts last year. We had the See Something, Say Something assemblies that went to every county in the state. We have 21 of them, David. These assemblies engaged kids as well as adults, and basically the message is this is happening in our schools, and if a kid or a teacher or a parent sees something, they should say something. And again, the hotline was given. It's a way of reaching the kids.
So I work for the U.S. Fund for UNICEF, and we have an awareness and advocacy campaign about human trafficking, and a lot of the work that we do is engaging with youth. So we have films, we have teacher resources that can be geared towards middle school and high school students so they can bring it into the classroom. We have created a toolkit with over 20 suggested ways to take action. So I have cards. I also have colleagues on the other side of the room. So we can, if you're interested in any of that, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards.
I think we have Kevin Cassidy from the ILO.
Yeah, International Labor Organization. Listen, fantastic. I'm so happy to hear that you're looking at the wider labor exploitation, because it has been focused on commercial sexual exploitation, which is the total abrogation of someone's rights. However, it's a part of a larger problem, and I think that that's fabulous. The idea about looking at the underpinnings, the socioeconomic underpinnings, it's social exclusion, it is poverty. Poverty is a consequence and a driving factor of trafficking. People are looking for work for themselves. We have a program on child labor, because child labor will turn into forced labor. This is all about forced labor issues. Our hashtag is decent work. It is about providing wages, opportunities, and training for people for the economy today, because when people don't have options, they will put themselves in very dangerous positions. So we have programs for kids, which are theatrical things called Scream, where they can act out some of the things that they've been doing or that have been perpetrated on them, to really get kids engaged, understanding, and then peer-to-peer counseling. And so there's a whole litany of things that the ILO has been working on, talking about how are we going to address this. The scope and scale of the problem is inconsequential, whether it's 21 million or 120 million or beyond. And the 150 million is a conservative number. As David indicated, it's going to be 5, 10 times more than that. But the issue is that if we see 3 people killed by a certain act, we get enraged. But are we not enraged that there are hundreds of millions of people out there that are exploited? So we need to do this. The U.S. has not ratified our conventions. We started this in 1929. Our first convention has come out. We called it forced labor by private actors. Then in 1957, we came out with another convention to upgrade that, to look at the political persecution of people if they were in a certain party, they weren't given food aid, and so, and then we've recently updated it last year to look at human trafficking as a part of the larger trafficking, of the protocol and recommendation. There's the Palermo protocols. There's all this international action. We have to internalize it. And it has to be not only with law enforcement, but it has to be with educators. It has to be with customs agents. It has to be with a whole range of people. And in businesses, it's not just the supply chain, but it's the value chain. It's everything in between. So please, go to the ILO website. We have an event next week at the UN on this very same issue with our experts, and Coca-Cola will be there talking about these issues. So we please encourage you to come to the ILO website, and any questions you have, please, I'm happy to answer.
And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Elaine Congress from the center.
Well, thank you all for coming. And what an exciting program. I just thought it was just so interesting. I want to introduce you to our partner, Francis Petit. As we said before, the Fordham Center for Nonprofit Leaders is a partnership of 2 schools, the Graduate School of Social Service, which is me, and the Graduate School of Business, which is Francis. So we all of our courses are taught by faculty from both schools, and the curriculum is designed to include both management skills and also social justice and advocacy. So it's really a partnership of both programs. I also really want to thank Pat Cole, who's one of our most outstanding, our star student, and we're just going to have to live up to it. And our Masters of Nonprofit Leadership. We have, as I think Alan mentioned earlier, we have a master's program, and a new master's program just launched this year. We also have a executive education training program. And we have a seminar series, and this is one of our seminars, and we see how great it is. And so if you get involved with our program, you can help partner with us in terms of doing a seminar. I wanted to also, and I'll tell you about a couple of really outstanding things we have coming up, but I also want to give a special thank you to our staff, Micah McKnight, who and Sandra, yeah. And also Priscilla Dwyer, our photographer, who helps us with it. Priscilla, put up your hand. Because, without them, it wouldn't be possible to put on a program like this. I wanted to just mention a couple of other events that we're doing. March 14th, and this is we're partnering with the Institute for Women and Girls. We're going to have a symposium. And our theme is in connection with the Commission on the Status of Women at the UN. So there'll be a lot of women who are here for this major conference who will be coming on Saturday. And our theme this year is post-Beijing 20 years. So we're going to be focusing on economic and health issues for women around the world. So now you're on our list, so you'll be invited to that. And also on April 9th, Dr. Billie Holiday, who is a former head of psychiatry at Sloan, so a major job, has written a book on healthy aging, and she's going to be doing our program on April 9th. So you're on our list. You signed in, so you'll hear about all of these programs. How many people have been to Fordham before, to other events? How many people have come for the first time? Okay, well, great. Well, welcome and come back. And we're a partnership. We partner with many groups and all. And I see here we have students from our students from our program, from our master's program. We also have my master's students, MSW students from the UN who are here, and we also partner with many community groups, who are here, and we're so pleased to be doing this with Manhattan Chamber of Commerce, and what an impressive program. I'm glad that we videotaped it, because one thing I found, running a conference, you're in and out, so I wasn't able to catch every bit of it, but what I heard, it was just very exciting, and this is such an important issue. So with that, thank you very much.
So again, we just want to say how delighted we were, and we're so grateful to all of our supporters, and particularly our panelists today. We hope you'll be able to stay and do a little bit of networking with us. Thank you for your support, your partnership, your social justice advocacy and action today and tomorrow and ongoing. Collectively, we can make this difference. Thank you very much.